who can't make it. It's been really cool working with Dr. Jha, because whenever she shows me like a qigong that she does, she's always talking about the different organs and the different elements and the different meridians and the different acupuncture points. So it's just another type of language to help remember, right? So when I say do 17, I get it. Most people don't know what that is, but we could easily look it up and we both know what we're talking about. And we're like, oh, that's the middle dantian. Somebody in the Tai Chi connection was like, well, that's stupid. Nobody knows what that, but they can look. Like if you don't, so it's a commonality so that we can find the same point and communicate. So it works. So hydrostacy begins with establishing your 4 directions of attention, at least one. However, if you can get all 4, you're going to be very rooted. You're going to be very present. Energy will be very balanced. Now, the idea is that if you couple imagination with breath, it's really difficult to unlink them. And that's okay. You know, if they're linked, then you're holding those 2 directions. Breathing with the imagination is super powerful. And then doing that and maintaining 4 directions will create space in the overall amount of cognition. And it's everything we've been doing from the beginning. It's only now we're doing it all the time. Remember, the first layer is forgetting all the time. Of course, that would mean that the hydrostacy layer is remembering all the time. And when we remember all the time, we create gaps in the overall amount of thought. And that is basically you're doing your tricks of attention. You're very connected to the present moment. You're very rooted. You're very stable. You're still surfing. Maybe there's stuff going on around you. Maybe you're at the grocery store during Christmas and people are just acting insane. Literally, it's a form of insanity. It's mob mentality. Everybody starts catching the same pace and bumping. And I'm like, guys, there's like 700 crowns of broccoli here. Like, it's not going anywhere. Just let Shayna choose which potatoes she wants. I mean, she waited her turn, right? So it literally just gets really insane. But so that's the surfing. Like, we still got to surf. So it's not as if balance becomes this stagnant image of perfection. That's silly. And now the first gate is when that space is created, to use your cognitive direction of attention to pay attention to that. That space has a feeling. That space can be observed and as soon as you start thinking, that space is gone because you're thinking. And the space that I'm talking about comes when the mind isn't thinking. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Ida and Karen? I'm describing the hydrostacy practice. Donna was here first, so I'm just kind of going to review this real quick.
Yes, it does.
Cool.
Sorry.
All right, so when we engage the space, what happens to the space, Donna? It gets bigger, it grows, and things will come up. You know, thoughts will arise from time to time in this space. Write them down, watch them float by, maybe entertain it for a second or two. I would be cautious with that because then there goes your space, but it's okay. So we're not trying to go to the extreme of no thought and it won't occur. It will just be different. It has a different quality to it. Typically, it's very insightful and it's even helping you organize. It helps me organize my thought, helps me organize my ideas and my creative pursuits. But even that, if it starts, even that can be a floodgate. And now all you're doing is sitting there organizing. And it's like, well, okay, this is out of balance now. So even that we want to be careful with. Ida, maybe you can resonate with this, but sometimes even creativity starts to feel out of balance. We have all of these creative ideas coming up and it's like, now I have 5 books that I started instead of just focusing on one. So anything can potentially get out of balance. Does that make sense? And then that gives us the opportunity to establish 2 more of our key techniques in the practice deliberate modulation and sensing the essence. I have a couple techniques that I personally do in order to have that happen. So that would be core, and I'm using different terminology. We'll go back and forth, and it hasn't changed. But when I talk about my teachings, I'll talk about 6 cores to those teachings. So it's also known as the 4th pillar, but deliberate modulation. And the reason I call these ones cores are because they're somewhat unique to our system. They're some of the unique defining factors of what we're doing that's very different from anything else that I've ever seen before. And then also, if I call them this and categorize them as this, it will be very hard for somebody to steal the intellectual property, which is a funny thing because I don't care if other people share it. But as my lawyer pointed out, if somebody steals your intellectual property, they can prevent me from talking about my own stuff. And I don't like that. If I get a cease and desist to not talk about the bridge, I'm not going to be particularly pleased with that. So reasonable caution, that's all. So does this make sense now? So for deliberate modulation, that's choosing how you want to feel. And then sensing energy is because our mind isn't in the way, we're able to connect to the moment and really pay attention to that emotional soup that we're creating. And we could even potentially store that into emotional memory for later. We actually will, no matter what. But you can be very specific if there's something that you're really enjoying and you want to put that into your emotional memory bag of tricks that you can pull out whenever you want. You will actually process things to memory, whether you know it or whether you want to or not, and then it will still be recalled later, potentially by accident. But deliberate modulation, so it doesn't sound too vibrational, it can also be looked at as emotional memory, which is a part of emotional intelligence, is being able to look at our emotional soups of the past and recreate them in our biofeedback, electrochemical, physiological, hormonal response. That's a way of looking at it so that it doesn't sound too woo-woo. Because sometimes the way that we talk about vibration is just silly. And I don't mean that to be rude or anything, but it gets very abstract. It gets so conceptual and so untangible that it's very difficult to work with until you're in hydrostacy. Then you're working with it. Does that make sense? So for deliberate modulation, I use the Peace Palace. That's been my go-to for a very long time. The waiting room of my Peace Palace is just appreciation. So typically I modulate to that as soon as I wake up in the morning. I create this space and I'm like, you know what? There's going to be a snowstorm outside and here I am. I'm in comfortable clothes, comfortable temperature. There's no bears, there's no impending doom. Space junk seems securely in the atmosphere. I'm okay. Like everything's okay. And that creates the baseline of contentment, which is, I use that word synonymous with happiness. So content, happy, appreciation, all good. Everything from there is just a bonus. So I can go into these bonus rooms that store different emotional vibrations or emotional memories. Does that make sense? Okay. And then sensing energy, I really like to, it's what I call the infinite nature, like the infinite aspect of the moment. Paying attention to detail just because. There's no reason or rhyme to it. I just pay attention to as many details as possible. And that starts, the moment starts to speak to me. I start to feel the essence of it because I'm populating my bubble of perception with more of it. So of course I can feel more of it because I'm paying attention to more of it. And then if, your imagination can take you from there and it can get quite pleasurable. to engage the moment in that way. And these two don't have to arise in any particular order. You can go outside, populate your bubble of perception, and you're instantly in that sensing energy moment. And then you can recall a memory if you want to. Those two are interchangeable. You can do whichever, you can even do both simultaneously, actually. You can create the emotional memory of gratitude and appreciation and happiness, and then all of a sudden new stuff is coming up with it. So you're feeling what I call differential rotation. We're not feeling one emotion at a time. That's erroneous. We're an emotional soup. Some people, that soup is a whole bunch of ingredients that they don't even know what. We're a very balanced soup. Our ingredients are measured. Probably tastes better too that way. Do those make sense? And then that creates what I call the second gate. And I don't really call it seeing because that can get woo-woo, but then again, I do. So it just depends on who I'm talking to. And I can explain what I mean by seeing. It's the exact same thing that they've meant for thousands and thousands of years with seers. But the second gate, is what I call dreamwalking. And dreamwalking arises from these four being in play. When these four are active, and then of course we're engaging the space to create more space, that will lend to an effect that I call dreamwalking. Now here's the reason I call it dreamwalking. Not just because it sounds cool, because I think it does. I like the sound of it, dreamwalking. But when you are lucid in a dream, when you're aware that you're dreaming, your nervous system recognizes it a little bit as well. And you stop responding to the dream the way that you would if you were non-lucid. Does that make sense? So if you're not lucid in a dream, your nervous system doesn't know the difference. And you can freak the fuck out, you get really scared about things, or you get really sad when you're having a sad dream, or you get really excited when you're having an excited dream. Does that make sense? Because your nervous system doesn't know that this isn't reality. I put that in air quotes, Donna, because it has its realness to it. Real and non-real, put them together and you have a new third thing. Does that make sense to you guys when I talk about that? So when you become lucid in a dream, all of a sudden your nervous system isn't responding with, holy shit, this is real. Because now you know that this is a dream. And you walk around the dream, you can do whatever you want in it. I have personal principles even in the dreamscape. It doesn't make sense for me to exist in an extreme when I'm in a dream. That's a different kind of cherry picking. And I know most people won't agree with that, who lucid dream, because they want to fly and they want to manifest in their dreams and help build money and all that kind of shit. But I'm not going to violate my personal principles just because I'm in a dream. So I maintain balance even in dreams. But that's not the point. So I'm not teaching lucid dreaming. That has nothing to do with it. The reason that I call it dreamwalking, though, is because I can take that feeling from the dream where my nervous system knows to the waking environment, where all of a sudden I know more about the totality of my experience. And all of a sudden, these burdens, these things of everyday life that we think are so important, such as Christmas and Christmas shopping and all this stuff, it doesn't have the weight that it used to. And now it feels like everyday life is like we're walking through a dream lucid. Does that make sense? Our nervous system is no longer fooled by some of these things that come up. It's not that important. Again, balance. I'm not going to say it's completely unimportant. Maybe you do want to get some Christmas shopping done. Maybe you do want to do something that you find entertaining. We're looking for balance here, right? So if you find painting entertaining, paint. If you find, rollerblading entertaining, rollerblade. However, if you feel that you have to rollerblade to feel ... then that could be a potential imbalance that we need to look at. And it could be the result of the nemesis from the destroyer. Does that make sense? So dream walking is you're going through your everyday life, but without the burden. Some people would call that enlightened. Lightness, freedom. The mind is no longer encumbered. There's less fear, there's less worry, there's less trying to control, there's less trying to manipulate. And that creates a whole new soup of consciousness and perception. Does that make sense? Now, I'll say that this aspect of hydrostacy comes up, and it doesn't necessarily come up in any particular order. I would say it's after the second gate that we start to interact with this one, though. But this will start to lend to what I call hunting power. You know, I always spell behavior wrong, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But it's behavioral change. Now, the reason that behavioral change is best to address after the dream walking is because the shit's not as heavy. You can do it much easier because it's not like, oh my God, I need. And so your lens of perception is more clear. So you're operating from a more clear lens. Does that make sense? And one of the procedures is to use your voice of power. And when you're about to do something that you know is out of balance, you remind yourself of the desire, you remind yourself of your intent. And this is going to sound a little tricky, but if you're in this dream walking, if you're in this space that you've created in your mind, the energy is flowing more viscerally. Whether you know it or not, whether you recognize it or not, you are flowing with more what I call personal power. So it's already starting to flow. Depending on that flow is how easily you align your intention, your desire, and your will. Does that make sense? The more you align those, the more the energy flows, the more visceral it gets, the easier it becomes to overlap. And then you end up with a very tiny triangle because they're all overlapping. Or you end up with a circle around the triangle and it's balanced again. Does that make sense? Just using, shapes and stuff to remember and kind of give analogies for how things feel and how it occurs. But that's when behaviors can start to change much more easily. Again, I wouldn't do this until I've established these first two gates, because then the mind will go to trying to control, trying to manipulate, labeling, judging, comparing, contrasting, should be, shouldn't be, should be this far by now, or yada, yada, yada. So I wouldn't even touch behavioral change at this point. I mean, at that point, if any of that's occurring. However, we're kind of reviewing. For some, it may still sound theoretical or even hypothetical, but yeah. Exactly, Ito. Once the leaking power stops, then we're just doing some things just because we want to be a little bit more healthy, just because we're feeling the imbalance. When we feel that imbalance, then we know it's time to, double down on our practice, come back to the moment, enlarge that space, and if necessary, voice the desire and the intention. If you voice it out loud, it's even more powerful. But if you're around people and that will seem weird, say it to yourself in your mind. This is my desire. This is my intention. And I'm going to align that with my power of will. Does that make sense? Of course, will has power when we put our attention there. Otherwise, it's just will. Just like a dream is just a dream until we add our attention. Our voice is just a voice until we add our attention. Once we add the attention, it becomes with power. Again, that's just how I talk about things, and it's consistent. Somebody else may say it differently. Does all that make sense so far? So that's building up behavioral change. We're aware of our emotions. We're creating new emotional memories and processing. And this is going to be one of the keys to adaptability. And adaptability is another triangle. And it's also the fifth or the sixth core. We've often referred to the sixth core as the act of alignment. But what's the purpose of being aligned? Like, why does that even matter? Because it makes us ultimately adaptable. The more that you're moving with everything else, the more that you can adapt when things start to change. If you're not moving with the flow, it's much more difficult to adapt to change as it occurs.
Allowing. We called it the act of allowing.
Yeah, we can call it either of those. I think active allowing sounds a bit woo-woo and it can get confusing because some people will look at allowing, the word allowing, as passivity. And I know that's not how we're using it, but that's how a lot of people will associate the word allowing to passivity. You mean I'm just allowing people to punch me in the face? You mean I'm just allowing? And they also start to look at allowing as both passivity and non-action. And of course, that's not how we're using the word. So it just depends on the audience, which one I'll say. Active allowing, active alignment, and the act of adaptation. But it's all three. It's the same thing. There's no difference.
People think that mindfulness is passivity, so
That's true. Yeah, to some extent, that's
yeah.
yeah. And that will bring up another triangle. We're getting deep into hydrostacy now. This is fun. And I included hunting power, so I didn't forget that one this time. In this one, we have intelligence. And it's so ironic when I spell words like intelligence wrong. That's a funny one. That's an ironic one to misspell. And wisdom. So knowledge, again, I'm just going to define my terms and people can do whatever they want with their words. Knowledge has three parts: information, personal experience, and the experience of others. It's really just two parts: experience and information. But the experience part can be broken up. Donna can tell me that in her experience, when she touches something that's red hot, it burns. And I could just say, you know what? That's good enough for me. I can use that knowledge and I don't have to go touch the pan. I get it. So some things that won't be as effective. Donna can't ever share her experience enough that would make me a good boxer. I got to get in there and do it because muscle memory needs to be established and stuff. Does that make sense? So knowledge, when acted upon, when you remember it, is wisdom. And I use the example of crossing the street. It's a very basic example, but you have the information that you should look both ways for safety. Donna shared the experience where she didn't look both ways and she got hit by a car. And then there was that one time where we didn't look both ways and we almost got hit by a car. That's a lot of knowledge, right? Like we should be super knowledgeable about looking both ways. But if we're distracted when we cross the street and we don't look both ways, that we did not apply unto wisdom. We didn't have the action point. We didn't remember. So wisdom has a lot to do with remembering what we've learned and then acting upon it. Desire, intention, and will definitely helps us act upon our wisdom. Does that make sense? Still good? I don't want to lose anyone because this is tricky. Intelligence is different. Intelligence permeates the universe. Intelligence is in rocks. It is in the atmosphere. It is in absolutely every single thing that exists. There is a fundamental intelligence in it. That's why it exists. That's why an atom is an atom and it coalesces to matter in the first place. It's a form of organizational intelligence. Intelligence is very organized. You could look at it that way. You put brain cells in a petri dish and it starts to organize itself and multiply. That is intelligence. That has absolutely nothing to do with knowledge. Does that make sense? It could lend to knowledge for sure, but you can skip the knowledge factor with intelligence. So what I mean is you could come to an idea or an insight, a point of reasoning that you didn't have the information about, that you didn't have anybody else's or any personal experience from, and it comes to you as a feeling, silent knowledge. You can start to translate it into words if you're good with that kind of thing. But then again, that's absolutely unnecessary. It can be done if you want to do it, but it's not necessary. Intelligence does not need words. That's, yes.
It's what's happening to me in class now all the time. I feel like I have gained some knowledge, some learning. Some learning is taking place, and it doesn't require words. And when I feel that imbalance of excitement about some aha, and then I try to put it into words, it takes me out of the
Yes.
actual experience. And now I just go, it doesn't matter because Ernest is going to talk about it soon. and then you do this class like this, and then I go, yeah, I know what that means because it's happening to me, and I've resisted the mind stream, habitual, repetitive need to put it into words yet. Just know it, learn it, and the words will come somehow, and usually you deliver them. So it saves me a step.
Happy to assist. All right, so now the thing is that if we have both of these triangles in place as I'm using it, then personal power just flows. And personal power, the way that I'm using the word, is infinite creative potential. Like this is the potential, the action potential in the universe is in this personal power. That intelligence is in there and it flows. So when we have this personal power and we have these three triangles in place, something happens and we become adaptable to change. Both psychological, yes.
What three triangles?
Two triangles, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my bad. Yeah, when we put these two triangles together, they'll form a sphere. That sphere represents personal power. And when these are in place, we are supremely adaptable to change in our environment, both psychologically and physically. And if we're adaptable to change over time, that is the definition of evolution. And now the mind and the body and the spirit, I use that word very loosely these days, the unseen aspect of the human experience can all evolve. It is the evolution factor. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, let's just finish up then. And that leads to another effect. And I guess I'll use the top of the whiteboard. Well, no, that doesn't make any sense to skip to the top. So I'll go from adaptable to a clean lens of perception. And by clean lens, I mean when we weren't doing this practice, we were thinking all the time, we were trying to control, we were feeding the nemesis, we had habit on top of habit on top of habit, imbalance on top of imbalance. And everything that we do, everything that we take in from our environment is going through that filter. Does that make sense? That I call the lens of perception. The lens of perception is your personal history, it's the I, it's the self, but it's also the physical body and the unseen aspect. It is the totality of the human being, is the lens of perception. And it has an infinite aspect to it, so we can only talk about it so much. Once you get too far into the infinite aspect of something, there's very little words. We need poetry now because we're trying to convey feeling, essence. Does that make sense? So we have found supreme adaptability. We're super adaptable. Things don't really take us out of our practice. We bob and weave. We keep swimming. Psychologically, we start to evolve. Cognitively, we start to evolve. Our bodies are evolving because we're dropping habits that don't benefit us. Before you know it, we're eating better, sleeping better, drinking better, interacting with humans better. And by better, I mean more efficiently, more authentically. And then everything that we're doing in our adaptable lives, which is the sixth core is adaptability. I guess I should write that up here. I'll put the other one. So we have the act of allowing and the act of alignment. Still an act because we're doing it. We're still active in our practice. We're just assuming all of that at this point, that we're still active in our practice. And then we clean the lens of perception. I'll put that up here, clear lens. And now everything going through that lens, our senses will result in different actions. It's like light bending in a manner of speaking. Stuff goes in, stuff comes out. It's kind of how it works. And then we get a different type of effect that I have just been calling ignition. Because I don't know there's no word for it in the English language. The reason I call it ignition is because everything comes alive and there's a vividness, there's a brightness. And that's when I stop, because that also starts to sound woo-woo. But there's no other way for me to talk about it, period. I can't. Like, there's no way for me to logically talk about something that is beyond physical. So what I think is happening, and I'll just say that I don't know, and I'm comfortable with not knowing, but what I think is happening is the unseen aspect of the human being has connected to the unseen aspect of everything else. The connecting link between finite and infinity has been strengthened to where it's very difficult to discern the difference. So when that happens, the feeling of the body comes alive, and the feeling and everything else comes alive, and you can see it. And when I say see it, I do mean it with eyes, although again, it's very difficult to describe. It's not like how you see other things, you see it but not see it. And that's when I have to stop talking about it, because now I'm talking in circles and it doesn't make any sense. But you see it with your senses, you feel it with your whole body, and you feel as if the feeling isn't just inside of you, it's everywhere. So that's why I believe that the ancients and the people of antiquity came to the conclusion that we are one with everything, even though they didn't have modern science to collaborate that with and to confirm that. That's why they came to this conclusion, because when they created enough space, all of a sudden that feeling, it's like you just know it's in everything. And what I think that what I'm feeling is that intelligence, that fundamental intelligence that permeates the universe, deliberate action, intent. Does that make sense? And then that's it. I think that there's a lot to explore from that point, but I'm never going to deliver that in a form of practice. When you get into that now, what I think happens is that lens of perception still includes your likes, the things that you've enjoyed doing your whole life, the things that you find entertaining. Your environment is a part of that lens of perception. And what we create will come from that ignition point. which is the third gate, by the way. Oh, I'll write that. Ignition is the third gate. And there's no real fourth gate that I have to talk about. But from this third gate comes more intelligence, more insight, more knowledge, more ahas, more creativity, and more opportunities to connect and feel the connection. And I don't know what else to call that other than ignition, because it feels very sudden that, and you have to pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention to it, the mind will start to slip and it'll start to deconstruct the process that has happened. And then now we don't have the space in our mind, and then the words start to come through, and then the patterns start to reinforce themselves, and we're nowhere near this feeling. Now, the more you practice, though, the hydrostatic practice, the easier it is to get back to that ignition point. Does that make sense? And if you come up with another word other than ignition, let me know. I'll entertain it. But yeah, that's the word that I have for it right now, because it seems like it's the springboard for everything else. And it also, that's how it feels. It's like, it just like exploded, in a manner of speaking. And this feeling, this thing that you see, it is alive, in a manner of speaking, and it is in everything, even rocks and dirt, everything. And that's why I think that these ancients of antiquity were able to come to this conclusion, because they came to it through a feeling. Maybe they used really weird ways of meditating to create the space, or they did different things to do that. We've done the bridge mindfulness practice to do that.
Around the fire.
What's that?
Around the fire.
Around the fire?
Yeah, they do it through dance. They do
Oh,
it through
sure.
music. They're sitting around the fire. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything that will interrupt the stream of internal self-talk long enough. It's one thing that I think is really, it shouldn't be, but it seems like one thing that's unique is that the more I read about like text from India and China and, the oldest texts, it's like they don't really target thought. It's like, I don't understand. They mention it to a certain extent, but it's not like they don't recognize that that is the main thing. And then sometimes they go from thinking to another type of thinking that the new thinking is better thinking. And then before you know it, it's turned into like a religious ideology. And now we're praying and doing all those things, which is okay. But
Well, I think it's because no one has ever looked at it through a clear lens within the modern technology world. We can make those comparisons with the ancients, but they weren't existing in the same construct that we are. And so although all of the fundamentals are exactly the same, the survival of the species and how it's become, how that macabre triangle gets distorted, and why is with a whole bunch of different elements at play. So I think that the message and the delivery of how to balance gets lost, because there's so much more to filter through, even though the principles are all exactly the same. While you were, the first time you showed me the macabre, we talked after class about where I had my confusion. It makes more sense now. It seems like if you had those transparencies that overlay, then you could add all the words, and it would make more sense, because you drew them separately, and hunting power came first, and then I can see how all of it goes together. That's why I tried to color code it. And this is what I mean by you making words for what I'm experiencing or I'm seeing. And watching the principles, it used to be, attempting to control, othering, all of those, whatever we're calling them, destroyers, the distractions, whatever. Now that I have this macabre image in my head, I was thinking of it while I was watching Zelensky yesterday. Um, Most of the time, I think of it when I'm watching something, I can see where the distortions are and where the imbalances exist. And man, that guy speaking, he was able to exist in a construct, which is war and politics, and understand all of the dynamics of that, and yet speak to the human element of survival and the survival of the species all at the same time. Like, holy shit balls. I was just amazed by what he was. Of course, he's trying to get money and he's trying to get help. But he put it. It was so well constructed. I could see that he was so balanced in all of those things, and hit that ignition point to deliver that message to the most powerful societal people that he could. I mean, he came from the front lines and secretly showed up, which was amazing. I was very well aware that I was watching a history happen, and that the survival of the species depends on people who can see that, like it. And on a much smaller, I don't want to say smaller, on a much different scale, it's the decision that you make with, what, I just want to, now that I can balance all of these things, I just want to go do that. And then you go, you know what, I think I want to deliver this more. I think it just needs to be out there. I have to get it out of me, because um, survival of the species depends on it. And the fact that I can organize it and put it in words and diagrams and books, I think I want to do that. And then I'll try to keep that within a balance for myself at the same time. I just, that's what I was watching when I watched him speak. It was remarkable to me, really remarkable.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that's it. So that's the end of the bridge system, is with that hydrostacy. Now, the only other aspect that I add after that, that's not deliverable yet, will be formal practices. So I'm not quite prepared yet to deliver formal practices in a way that I feel authentic and comfortable with, but I'm very close. So that's going to be within the year. Now, to teach the bridge, I would expect somebody to have to be a full, all the way, ambassador of the entire system. You have to have a formal practice to share. It could be just one. That's okay. It could be meditation, sitting meditation at a certain point, standing meditation, anything, yoga, chanting, kundalini, I don't care. It's something that you can share to give somebody a very formal practice, because the formal practices will build more personal power.
I can absolutely see the importance and the necessity of that in order to keep that balance. Just recently, after moving and all of my nonsense, I have adapted a few formal practices. And I noticed that what you were saying about the Koreans, starting with the physical, and they weren't talking about the thoughts, they were talking about once you master the physical body, then the thoughts come after that. I can understand it, because until I really committed to a formal practices, um, I automatically go to the thought place. So I automatically go to the thought place, and then becomes a better thinking to replace the old thinking. And then, I just since I started formal practice, I woke up in the night and noticed that I sleep I'm a side sleeper for the most part. The more that I do physical practices, the more that I sleep on my back for alignment. And I also noticed that when I'm crunched up in a ball, it's just not. I I I think I actually woke up so that I could align myself better, because I could feel that it wasn't. It was an extreme that wasn't serving me, and so I can see why focus. I tend to ignore the physical. I think that if I can just master my mind, then my physical will take care of itself, and it doesn't, because I've fallen, I've gotten a concussion, I've, I've done a lot of things that were physically incorrect because of my lack of awareness on it. So I understand that the modern mind is up in your head and not in your body most of the time. So that's really important.
Yes. Yeah. It will, all happen on its own, but the desire to move will occur. The desire to, so my sitting meditation, it's a desire I have. Like my body, that's the silent knowledge. The body's like, you got to move. Like you can't just sit here stagnant. So it is the same thing. Like it is taking care of itself through communication, through feeling. And it's like, I got to move. I got to do something. That's the body telling you that we've gotten a little too still here. So we got to keep things doing.
Yeah, and it also enhances your ability to use your sensory perception
Mhm.
as a technique and a tool in balance with everything else you're doing. Otherwise, it's all about the visual or thinking, and the senses are part of the body awareness. So um, it's out of balance unless you're doing it.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it. So yeah. How many more of these do we have? We still have next week, right? And then that will be the last one of the year. All right. So the 29th is the last one of the year. So we'll do the year in review. We'll just kind of quickly go over the entire bridge system on the 29th. I'll make a little announcement for that will be our year in review. And then we can kind of decide as a group what we want to do for next year. Group study is still kind of just meeting each other where we're at. And then we have 20 essential topics that we're going through, which was 20 weeks of delivery. And then we could decide what we want to do on Tuesdays, if we want to keep Tuesdays or maybe Donna wants to pick something up and start doing the book study or whatever. I haven't been applying any pressure to do any of those things whatsoever. But maybe, you're feeling more inspiration to share, because Donna's right. The survival of the human species is fundamentally directly relatable to the human achieving balance. And that's what I don't see in some of these ancient texts. They wanted to be perfect. They want to see ultimate reality. They want their self, which is very interesting. So they're trying to divorce the self so that the self can somehow move on into a different realm of whatever after death. And I just kind of I leave all that alone. I don't really see the point in that. I think that was an example of their environment that was very important to the people of that time. What happens when we die, and what is ultimate reality, and what is perfection. And I've just kind of rejected all of that as an extreme. Okay. Well, that's all I got. Any questions, comments, or concerns about that? Okay. Yeah, Donna, if you want to stay on, if Donna just wants to have a quick personal conversation real quick, but we are done here, so I'll stop the recording. Da, da, da.